Eddie Chavez, Ruben Nava, and Jesse Romero. Jesus 911.
Jesus 911 on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. My name's Ruben Nava. My partner is Jesse Romero. Together we make up Jesus 911. We're Muscular Christianity is what we do on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today we have a special guest. Today, Jesse we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. And let me just tell you about our guest. Since 2015, he's been welcomed into 10 different states to give this presentation, and he's an expert at what he's doing here. He's been at 17 different dioceses. He has letters from bishops and that will attest to his expertise. And we are going to be fascinated by what we're going to hear tonight. Okay, so he's worldwide renowned of what he's doing here. And I'm had an introduction. I'm kind of lost it here, but anyway, go ahead, Jesse.
Let me
welcome
jump
to
in here, Ruben.
Jim Bertrand.
Jim, welcome to the Jesus 911. Can you hear us, my friend?
Good morning, Jess and Ruben. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good morning.
Yeah, I can hear you. Jim,
well, we're good to go. Thanks to St. Clair for helping us on that one.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic because the Shroud of Turin, which we're going to ask you some questions about, this essentially is something that validates the most important teaching in New Testament Christianity, I dare say in Catholic Christianity, and that's the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In fact, a movie's being made right now by Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel starring on the resurrection. I think it's going to be life-changing. But this has always fascinated me, the Shroud of Turin, because once again, as St. Paul says in the New Testament, our very hope lies on the fact of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let's get right into this. Jim, tell us how you got introduced into giving presentations on the Shroud of Turin. Tell us a little bit about your background and what prepared you to start giving these presentations on the Holy Shroud of Turin.
Sure, I'll be glad to. Well, about 40 years ago, I began teaching high school science. And about that same time, there was an article in National Geographic magazine that summarized the findings of the Shroud of Turin research project, which, as some of you may know, back in 1978, Dr. John Jackson of the Air Force Academy, PhD in physics, he led a team of 30-some scientists over to Turin to study the Shroud using all the equipment they had at that time, and they studied everything from anatomy to X-rays and everything else in between. It was an all-star team of scientists. Only 3 of them were Catholic. There were some Jews, there were some Protestants, there was Mormons, there was agnostics, there were atheists. But these were scientists who were all experts in their field. Some of them came from Los Alamos, which is, of course, we got the atomic bomb, Jet Propulsion Lab, worked with NASA, and they were trying to answer the question, how was this image formed? And I remember reading this article in National Geographic. It just fascinated me. And over the next few decades, I began studying more and more that I could on the Shroud. And in 1990, I invited Dr. Jackson to come speak at my parish. And so he came from Colorado Springs to Lincoln, Nebraska. We became friends. And that really kind of began my odyssey of gaining more and more knowledge about this. We kept in touch over the years. Long story short, in 2014, there was an international Shroud conference here in the United States in St. Louis. And I was privileged to attend that. They asked me to come. Dr. Jackson and the person who helped to organize all of his scientific information and put it into a book, 4 decades of his research about Siefer. And I went to the St. Louis conference and saw 42 presentations on the Shroud. There were scientists from all over the world, England, Spain, France, Germany, the United States, and just had some very convincing evidence. And it really opened my eyes. I didn't realize there was such an overwhelming consensus among the scientific community. There's a few differences as well, but most people may be surprised to find out that in the last century, There's been over 1,400 scientists weigh in on this, and they come in about 8-1 in favor of authenticity. So it's not 100% certain, but it's certainly very well established in much of the data we have on the Shroud. And so they asked me after this conference if I could look at his book and turn that into a PowerPoint and share this information, share this factual information with people. And it's not really a scientific debate. It's simply give people the facts, and the facts speak for themselves. And so that's where I've been in terms of my preparation on this, plus teaching 40 years of science.
Yeah. I'm sorry about botching your introduction, Jim. Jim comes with us with some high credentials, a master's degree in education. As you heard him say, he's been teaching for over 40 years, and he's coming to us from. You're still in Lincoln, Nebraska, correct, Jim?
That is correct.
Okay, awesome. Just curious. Do you carry this show over there, or how did you hear about Virgin Most Powerful Radio?
Well, I actually I had about 17 of my in-person presentations were postponed this year. I'd done 14 of them through the mid-March.
Okay.
And then with the COVID thing, a lot of the other presentations I had set up, they said, let's wait till next year. So I've got 17 of them deferred to next year. And so I thought, well, let's do some radio things. I did do some PowerPoints for the Denver Women's Conference and some online things. And I just did a search, and I happened to find your site out of, I believe, Covina, California.
Yeah.
Interesting. I spent 2 summers out there in a little town some of you might have heard of called Norco.
Oh, yeah.
It's not far from Riverside. Back in 1980 and 1981, I went out there and spent some summers working out there. So I know that area well, and that's where I learned how to drive freeways with a 5-speed truck.
Okay.
And after coming back from that experience, I feel like I can handle any road situation now that I've done the California driving.
That's right. So you've done over 194 presentations, 10 states, 17 dioceses, and it's been seen by over 15,000 people. And you've been to New Zealand, and you've given this presentation. This is just your life's passion at this point, I would imagine, Jim. You're not. This is not for profit. That what you're doing. I commend you on this because you're getting Catholics. You're making them aware of this, of the risen Christ, and this is it's something that goes to our faith and reason. If I'm not mistaken, you've got the scientific data to back it up. Although I'm sure we're going to get into the carbon dating and all that later. But I really commend you for what you're doing. That you're honoring our Lord in doing this and making people aware of, if they weren't aware yet, of what He's done for us, and just the.
Yes, well, thank you, Ruben. And I think that ties into what Jesse said at the very beginning a few minutes ago about the resurrection and the passion for teaching this, because our faith rests on the reality of the resurrection. The resurrection was a reality in our Catholic faith, and the fact that science can't reproduce the resurrection. Science can't prove the resurrection, but that's a shortcoming of science and not the resurrection. Science has limitations. And so when we combine that with our faith in that God exists as the Trinity, we have an immortal soul, the existence of angels, heaven and hell, those supernatural realities, when you accept those on faith, as well as what we see in reason with the physical world, then I think you have a picture of reality. And unfortunately for many people, they have the physical, reason part only, but reason without faith is a very limited view of reality. So we need both. As in all things Catholic, we need both.
That's right.
Jim, so give us a little overview of the Shroud. Okay, what is it that you're going to be talking about when you go to parishes? Tell the people that don't know what that means or what that is. Tell us, what is the Shroud of Turin for those who aren't familiar?
Well, I'm sure you have a wide diversity of people listening right now, people driving down the interstates and highways, people at home, and some of them have heard of it, some of them have never heard of it before. But this is a cloth, all right, made of linen. It's not cotton. It's a linen cloth of a very specific type of weave called a 3-in-1 herringbone weave. Instead of going checkerboard, over one, under one, you go over 3 threads and under one, over 3 and under one. It's a very specific stitching pattern that was present at the time of Christ, called the 3-in-1 herringbone weave, the Jewish weave. And the cloth itself is 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide, which is the exact dimensions of 2 cubits by 8 cubits. A cubit from the elbow to the top of your fingers, about 21.7 inches, was the standard Syrian cubit used at the time. So we have this very specific type of Jewish cloth that you could wrap a person in. Imagine a person laying down on it with the open end down at its foot, and then taking the rest of it over your head so that both ends of the cloth are down at the feet. And then Jewish people have been burying their dead this way for thousands of years, and they continue to this day to bury them in linen, sometimes directly into the ground, sometimes in a pine coffin. But what's unique about this cloth is that it bears the image of a beaten, scourged, and crucified man. And it's a very mysterious image. We'll get into some of the traits of that later. They found there's no paint on it. This is not something that an artist could do. And so the mystery is, how could this image have come about? And we see a man who's scourged on the back. We see a man with crucifixion marks in the wrists or down toward the palm of the hands. We see crucifixion holes in the feet. We see a lance wound in the side. And the thing that really tops it off, no pun intended here, is that we see wounds on the head from a cap of thorns. And there's only one person in history that all these things were done to. There were thousands of people that were crucified and scourged, but a lance wound in the side is pretty unique, as well as the
Jim, could you? We're coming up on our first break, Jim. So we hear the music. So you're listening to Jesus 911. We're talking to Jim Bertrand about the Shroud of Turin. We'll be right back. I want to change that dial.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning and love is the end. And God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
How does the baby move in your tummy? How does the baby eat? Can the baby hear me? How did the baby get in there?
Wow, a pregnancy can sure generate a lot of questions. But what's important is that a baby is a baby, inside and out of the womb. Not just after birth, but 9 months before. At conception.
That's right. Every baby is a miracle. Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org, or better yet, simply dial pound 250 on your cell phone and say the keyword pro-life. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
A baby's heart is beating 18 days from conception.
Pro-life across America, the Billboard people.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Jesus 911. If this call is not an emergency, dial 888-526-2151.
Jesus 911, two-man car. We have a ride-along today. Jim, we both Jesse and I are both retired law enforcement sheriff's deputies out here in LA County, and so we sometimes we'll use police language and lingo to talk. I'm holding up a book. I just happened to look at my library yesterday, The Shroud of Turin, and it's from a library. I inherited some books from someone's collection, and this is from a college in Chicago. But lo and behold, and I hadn't opened it yet, but lo and behold, they have some images of the shroud here. That come with it with an explanation, and it looks fascinating. So I just thought I'd point that out, that there are books out there. People, after today's show, you might want to delve into this topic. I know for sure I am. So what are some of the features, Jim, of the shroud that support its authenticity?
Sure. Well, one of the first ones you look at is the blood. And what's unique about this blood, it's been tested several times, and it is human blood, all right? But it's still red.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know anything about blood, after blood comes out of a body, hits the pavement or whatever, within a day or two, it's pretty brown, and within a week, it'll be black. And that blood will turn dark in color. But this blood is still red. And so that's what led some scientists to think, well, maybe this is just paint, because there's no way blood should be red after all these years. But they tested it, and it's not paint. It is blood. It is human blood. And what happens is, in the 20th century, we discovered that when a person suffers a severe trauma and they lose 20 or 30 or 40% of their blood volume, the body responds, and that the liver produces a very, very bright red protein called bilirubin. It goes into your bloodstream, and it speeds up the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin to your oxygen-starved blood cells. All right? But once this blood, which is rich in bilirubin, comes out of the body onto a cloth or whatever, then it stays red indefinitely, perhaps till the end of time. So my point is, the blood on the shroud is not just blood from any man, it is blood from a man who suffered a severe trauma. And we know that in the scourging, our Lord suffered a severe trauma. There have been studies on this, and there's something like 372 wounds on the body from the scourging, 159 on the front, and 213 wounds on the back. There were likely more than this, because the image itself does not contain any side images. You don't see the sides of the head, you don't see the ears, you don't see what would be under the arms, down to your hip. And so there's no side images visible, but just on the front and back alone, over 372 images, 372 wounds. Now, besides this blood component, they have found dirt on the shroud in 3 places: on the nose, and the knees, and the soles of the feet. 3 places of our Lord's body that would have come into contact with the ground on Good Friday happened to show up on those 3 spots on the shroud. And it's a unique type of soil called travertine aragonite soil, and it's found only in Jerusalem and a handful of places on earth. So you've got this, unique image of a man that fits the description of the crucifixion of Christ. You've got the Jerusalem soil, you've got this Jerusalem weave, you've got a Jewish weave, and along with that we find some pollen grains. The Swiss criminologist Dr. Max Fry in the 1970s did a study on pollen grains, and by looking at pollen grains, you can tell where a certain item has been, because the grains of pollen are unique perhaps to that specific species of plant. And his work was followed up by a Jewish botanist, Avinom Donin, and they confirmed that there were some 13 different species of pollen grains that were found on the shroud that are unique to the Jerusalem area, and several other species that are unique to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. And both of those locations are, we believe, a part of the shroud's history as it moved from Jerusalem through Constantinople, and then later through France and into Italy. So there's a handful for you. There's some other things I can talk about as well, but I'll give you time to ask another question if you like.
Sure.
Yeah, Jim, tell us a little bit about, I've heard Father Robert Spitzer on EWT, and he talked about that it would be close to like 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy that came out of that dead body, so that it could penetrate, I guess, the cloth. I found that number incredible. 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy that came from that dead body in a single second to give us this supernatural image that we call the Shroud of Turin. Do you know anything about that? Have you heard something about that?
Yes, you're talking about the question, how was the image formed?
Yes.
Just what was the mechanism to form this image?
Okay.
And in their study of 1978, those scientists published in 20 different scientific peer-reviewed journals all of their findings, and they were trying to answer that question. And after 3 years, peer review, they published their final report called the 1981 Stirk Report. And they could not answer the question, how was the image formed? But they did say these 3 facts. Fact number 1, no paints, pigments, or dyes have been found on the image-bearing thread fibers. So there's no stuff where you see the image. It's simply yellow fibers by some type of process. Secondly, this image is not the work of an artist. And there are 17 traits about the shroud, and most of them cannot be explained by the work of an artist. So we know that this can only be done by human means. And the trait we're specifically talking about here is superficiality. It's such a thin, faint image. And then thirdly, there are no chemical or physical methods that can account for the totality of this image. So this is a test of good science. Here we are 40 years later, and those 3 statements still hold up. They've withstood the test of time and scientific scrutiny. Okay. Now, getting back to your question about, was light a mechanism? Well, if at the moment of the resurrection there were a burst of light coming from the body that somehow put this image on the cloth, there appears to be a correlation between the cloth to body distance. Now, think about that a second. Where the cloth goes over the nose, that's going to get a direct contact type of radiation burst. Whereas the eyes might be 2 centimeters deeper, they're going to get a lower dose. And it just appears that the entire body shows a direct correlation between what was the distance between the cloth and the body at the moment of image formation. You could call that a radiation event, call it the resurrection, if you like. And it's been estimated that if you took every laser on Earth and blasted it over the surface area of the shroud for 40 billionths of a second, that's 10 to the negative 8. A nanosecond is a 1 billionth of a second. So if you took every laser and blasted on the shroud for 10 billionths of a second, that might be sufficient to produce this superficial image. It is so thin. To give you an idea of this, you know how thin a millimeter is. Like a paper clip is about 1 millimeter thick. Okay? The shroud fibers are microscopic, and it takes 1,000 microns to equal 1 millimeter. The thickness of the image on these threads are 2/10 of 1 micron.
Wow.
And there's 1,000 microns in a millimeter. And so this is just a very, very faint image that is something we cannot reproduce. So this is one of the many unique traits about the shroud. I will say that early research in the 20th century investigated several artist theories, but there were 6 of them published, and all of them had failed to account for the image. And so the main research area now is, if you're trying to answer the question, how was the image formed, it focuses on radiation, whether it was photons of light, as proposed by Dr. John Jackson, whether it was a neutron flux, as proposed by Dr. Rob Rucker of Washington State, or whether it was an electron coronal discharge, as proposed by the Italian scientist Dr. Ponti. So those are the 3 current hypotheses, but they all focus in on radiation. Yeah. And it's possible that we may never understand how this image was formed, because the shroud is a physical manifestation, an icon of that, if you will, of the suffering, death, and resurrection of our Lord. And the resurrection is a supernatural event. So was the mechanism a physical mechanism or a supernatural one? We believe it certainly had a supernatural cause.
Absolutely.
We trust it to be authentic.
Absolutely. I have to agree with you what you said about the blood. Having been at many crime scenes, Jim, and found been at where bodies have been decomposing, the blood does turn brown and in many cases black. And but in law enforcement, we're concerned with the chain of custody or the chain of evidence. Where's this? If the shroud's authentic, can you give us a history of where the shroud's been, beginning with the empty tomb? In fact, I believe that it was in the hands of the king of Italy. They owned it at one point. Is that correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
What we'll do is we'll start, on Easter morning, John and Peter looked in and saw and believed. And then later, what happens to the shroud? Well, it's in Jerusalem to begin with, but it would have been considered unclean to touch a burial cloth of the dead. And so it's not advertised, it's not written about. They would be considered, grave robbers and unclean if they said, hey, look what we've got here. It would have been confiscated for certain and destroyed. So it's kept under wraps, so to speak. But we do have a hint from the Acts of the Apostles, and that at about the year 44 AD, there was a persecution in Jerusalem, and St. Peter went to Antioch. And Antioch was one of the three most important cities of the Roman Empire at that time. And St. Jerome, from the 4th century, held a document in his hand. It did not become part of the canon of our Bible. It's called the Lost Gospel of the Hebrews. And it states in this, St. Jerome, holding this in his hands, writes about it, that the high priest brought with him from Jerusalem the burial cloths of the dead and risen one. And so we believe that they could have taken the Antioch route and then to Constantinople in 574. There's another hypothesis out there by a British scientist, Ian Wilson, and he proposes that it went through Edessa, from Jerusalem to Edessa, in a later and didn't leave Edessa until 944. But in any event, regardless of those two scenarios, we know that it's in Constantinople, beginning there from 944, probably from 574 onwards. And then in 1201, they took an inventory. Nicholas Meserites records that among the many relics of the saints that they had there, remember, this city used to be called Byzantium, and then it became Constantinople in the 4th century, and there were hundreds of relics there. And after 1930, it became known as the city of Istanbul. And he records it in the inventory in 1201. In 1204, we have an eyewitness account, a French knight, Robert de Clary, who was in Constantinople at the Fourth Crusade, just before the sack of Constantinople, which is another story in itself. He records seeing how the burial cloths of our Lord were raised up for people to venerate on Fridays. And we see fold marks that fit perfectly with his description. So we know that it was Constantinople right about the Fourth Crusade. Now, from 1204 to 1355, it disappears. So for about 350 years, we're not certain exactly where it's at. These are called the missing years, but it turns up in Lirey, France after this time. And from this moment on, the chain of custody is fairly certain. It's not in dispute. Everyone agrees that it was in Lirey, France. And in 1453, by the way,
hold on, Jim.
at that time, he was in the possession of
Jim,
a knight, Geoffrey de Charnay.
We're going to hold that thought, Jim. We're going to pick up on the other side of the break. This is interesting. We're talking to Jim Bertrand about the Shroud of Turin. Be right back.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin's Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
If you shop on Amazon.com, there's an easy way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Just visit smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center under the desired charity. Now, when you log into your Amazon account and purchase products, a portion of it will automatically go to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio at no cost to you. Thanks in advance for supporting CRC and VMPR, and may God richly bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Jesus 911. If this call is not an emergency, dial 888-526-2151.
We are back, Jesus 911, where iron sharpens iron and one man sharpens another. We have a special guest today, Jim Bertrand from Lincoln, Nebraska, giving us a fascinating explanation of the shroud. And Jim, you were talking about the chain of custody, so I think you were... there was that period of time where you left off where it was...
Right. Yeah, we got it through about 15 centuries, about 3/4 of the way through the history there.
Okay.
And the knight Joffrey de Charnay, when he received the shroud in 1355, it was displayed for 40,000 people. And the question was asked him, where did you get this from? Where did this come from? And his reply was simply, it was freely given. And that's where the explanation ends. And that's why we call this the missing years, from 1204 to 1355. We have many relics and artifacts and drawings and paintings from history before the 12th century that are based on the shroud. Right? For example, there's a famous icon called the Pantocrator icon. You've probably seen this if you go into an Orthodox church. It's the most commonly recognized icon. Comparing that face with the shroud, there are over 150 points of congruence. And of course, in a court of law, if you have up to 60 points of congruence, that is enough to confirm that this image and the person are the same. With 150 points of congruence, there's just no doubt that whoever made that image of that icon had to have been looking at the shroud. The only difference is in that image, the eyes are open, and on the shroud, the eyes are closed. But continuing with 1355 here, about a century later, his family gave it to the House of Savoy. And this was a dynasty that began in the 10th century and lasted all the way till the 20th century. It wasn't until after World War II, when Italy switched from a monarchy to a different form of government, that the House of Savoy existed. So they were a very powerful family, and they ruled this area of southern France and northern Italy. That was in 1453. And there was a fire in 1531 while it was being housed at a church in Chambéry, France. And that the shroud was folded into 16 layers, and it was in a silver casket. And the heat melted the silver. A piece dropped through and burned 16 holes into the shroud. And that's where we see the 16 patches that were sewn on it. Those were taken off in 2002. But if you look at the shroud, it's the most prominent feature that people will recognize is all of these holes. And these holes came from that fire. Well, in 1578, the Duke Filbert of Savoy, he brought the shroud with him to Turin, Italy. And it was housed there in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist that was completed in 1594. And that is where the shroud has been ever since. In 1978, the reason they showed the shroud that year was because that was the 400th anniversary of the shroud coming to Turin in 1578. And right now, as we speak, that is where the shroud is at. It has been in Turin there for over 4 centuries now. It was taken away at one brief period of time during World War II to keep it away from Hitler because he was looking for it. And after the war, it was covertly brought back. So that gives you a history of where the shroud's been, basically from Jerusalem to Antioch to Constantinople and then to Lille, France, down to Turin, Italy, where it's at today.
Jim, why isn't that we see more popes in the Catholic Church promoting this or making a lot about this? I mean, this has science and history to validate it. We've got the New Testament story. Why is it that you think that there isn't more of a push from even the magisterium of the church or the popes promulgating this, maybe as the ultimate icon in possession of the Catholic Church? Why don't you? It seems to me the only people talking about this are lay people. I don't see bishops, cardinals talking about this. I don't see papal encyclicals on this. I don't see homilies on this. I see formal former high school teachers like you all over the country talking about this. What's going on?
Well, over history, I think Francis now is the 266th successor of St. Peter. We have a record of at least 34 popes speaking out that are favorably disposed toward the shroud as being authentic. In more recent times, I think what happened was after the carbon dating test of 1988, that came out and it seemed to question the authenticity of the shroud. And so perhaps there was a hesitancy about, well, gosh, we don't want this to appear that we're opposing science, so that maybe there was some more quiet about that. But you use that word icon, and that word icon can have more than one meaning. An icon can be a physical portrait or a picture, but an icon can also be a person. You could say a certain sports hero is an icon. Well, they're certainly real, and it is in that sense that the realness of the man on the shroud that we believe this icon to be. Matter of fact, I gave this to a seminary, this presentation, and so many of the seminarians said that this makes Jesus so real. We think of the Blessed Sacrament, which we believe is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. We believe in that reality. And believe it or not, there have been some Eucharistic miracles where they've tested the blood type. I can think of 3 off the top of my head. One was in Mexico this century. One was in Argentina. And there was another one in Italy, one of the oldest ones. All 3 of those, the blood type has been tested to be AB blood, which is a fairly rare type. So that alone is a very, very rare coincidence. But the fact is that the blood on the shroud is also type AB. Certainly, seems to connect the dots. And, in the end, even if we were to be able to get some DNA off the shroud, we probably won't be able to do that. DNA fragments over time. So after many, many centuries, the DNA falls into pieces and it gets mixed in with other DNA. There's DNA in pollen grains, there's DNA in bacteria. And so you have a very difficult, if not impossible, time of lifting DNA off the shroud and being able to state with certainty that, oh, this is definitely the DNA of Jesus. It's all of his and only his, because it's going to be mixed with other things. So, but if our faith is strong enough, I have no doubt that if you tested the DNA from the Eucharistic miracles to the DNA on the shroud of Christ, it would match. But I don't need that scientific test to convince me, of its authenticity. I would say that when people see this talk, many times they come up to me afterwards and they say, gee, I came here kind of, wondering about this, but now it seems like the question isn't any longer, is it the shroud authentic, but rather, how could it not be? And so the onus of proof, really, because of the overwhelming evidence, the onus of proof would be on what we call the doubters. And so that's where we're at today with that, I believe.
Jim, about the carbon dating test you mentioned back in 1998 or 88, at that time it was seen as a challenge to the shroud being authentic. But since they thought it came from the 14th century, how has that test been confirmed or invalidated? I know I remember reading about some errors that were that could play into the fact that they came up with a 14th century date as opposed to the first century.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you what, the short answer to that is that it has been invalidated. These samples they took were about the size of your thumbnail. So think a little postage size stamp. And there were 15 protocols that were drawn up in 1988 that were supposed to be followed. All 15 of them were violated in terms of they were supposed to use 7 laboratories. They were supposed to take it from 3 different spots of the shroud and so forth. Well, they took it from one little spot of the shroud that could fit on a 3x5 card, and it turned out to be the most contaminated area of the shroud. And in the realm of carbon dating, contamination is a very real problem. Carbon dating is still used today, and it can be very validly used. However, about 20% of all results are thrown out because the results show that there's impurities that can get onto a sample that disrupt it. Basically, what they showed in 1988 was that these labs said that it came from the year 1325, plus or minus 65 years, somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. What was found later is that this data didn't appear to match. They said with 95% certainty that this was valid. That was questioned at the time, but we never could get our hands on what's called the raw data. The raw data was, what did the machines actually say? What were the readings? And when they did their math on this, there was an error in what that was posted in Nature magazine, but it didn't come out until 30 years later. And this was published in Nature magazine in 1989. In 2019, we had been trying to get the data for 30 years. And finally, we went to the courts, and a man named Christian Casabianca and Professor Emanuela Marinelli from Italy, they invoked the courts what's called the Freedom of Information Act, FOI. It's an international law. It's been around for decades. It's also here in the United States, in which you must provide the data if you're going to make some type of claim. And so for the first time since the carbon test, we got our hands on the raw data, and the raw data showed that every inch, it was varying by about a century. Imagine that. Imagine a piece of cloth, and you test the carbon-12 to carbon-14 ratio, and then 1 inch closer to the middle, it's 91 to 97 years younger, and an inch closer from there, it varies by another 91 to 97 years. This is significant deviation. It has a chi-square value that put it a reliability of less than 1%. And they claimed in their paper of 1989 that it was within 95% certainty that it was valid, and it was invalid. The test is called a chi-square value, and basically it showed significant deviation. So this came out in April of 2019, and since that time, there's been an avalanche of scientific papers from all over the world confirming this data that it was invalid, that the numbers they used were not rounded. For example, they took the number 4.1, and in order to make it 5% reliable, rounded it up to 5%. And so that was fairly academically dishonest, if you want to consider it that way. So the carbon dating test in the scientific world is no longer a point of contention. I think perhaps maybe in the general population, people might feel like, oh, this is a 50-50 thing where the scientists are divided on. They're not divided on this at all. The carbon dating test of 1988 was invalidated conclusively by the Freedom of Information Act in 2019. And there's just, like I say, an avalanche of scientific papers out there confirming that. It doesn't prove that it's Jesus, but it proves that it was not a 13th or 14th century forgery.
Jim, the backing of the shroud, it had wasn't there another piece of cloth that was behind it that was put on by
sure
religious?
The fire from 1532, December 4th, 1532. A couple years later, in 1534, that was when the shroud, it was with all these holes in it, they decided they needed to do something. So these Poor Clare nuns, they got a piece of what's called Holland backing.
Jim, we're going to have to hold off. We hear the music. We're talking with Jim Bertrand here. He's an expert on the Shroud of Turin. He's an engineer. He's a teacher. He's the lover of God. He's a faithful Catholic. You don't want to miss what's up next. Don't turn that dial.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Jesus 911. If this call is not an emergency, dial 888-526-2151.
Jesus 911 Soul Patrol, two-man car, Jess and Ruben. We're here with Jim Bertrand. He's an expert on the Shroud of Turin. Jim, I would love to see you give this presentation to the entire USCCB, to the Roman Curia, to the Holy Father. I mean, this is fascinating. This is what the church needs more of. We need more presentations on the supernatural. This is what we're lacking. Modernism has infiltrated the Catholic Church, and we hear all these talks on just things that are natural, like, hey, let's go and skim the oceans and take plastic out of the ocean water. We need to be talking about things like this, and this is why St. Paul talks about encourage one another and build one another up. This is how you build up the body of Christ, is by talking about the supernatural. So, Jim, let me ask you a question. What about Protestant scientists or Protestant believers? What's their take on the Shroud of Turin presentations when you give it to them? Any feedback from like secular colleges or Lutherans or Protestant seminaries? And also, have you ever given this talk in prisons? Because I seem to think that prisoners seem to be the hungriest population when it comes to wanting to know about God, because they've made a mess of their life up to that point, and you find a lot of them very open to the things of God. Comments, thoughts?
Questions here. First off, the non-Catholic settings and then the prison. Some of the non-Catholic settings have been in secular universities. I give it to a Lutheran parish, and I gave it to a Russian Orthodox church outside of Russia. It's here in Nebraska. The diocese, there's a Moscow Orthodox church, one of the 14 Orthodox churches, but all of the Russian Orthodox parishes outside that are in the diocese of the Russian Orthodox church outside Russia. And I think in all of these settings, they were very receptive to it. The laity is very receptive to it. The Orthodox church is very receptive to it. I think where you sometimes see the questioning and doubting is when for instance, I've had Protestant people that came up after this and said, wow, I'm going to tell my pastor about this and have you come to our church. And then you never hear from him again, or you contact some of those Protestant parishes. And sometimes the pastors are reluctant because they see this as a Catholic thing. And the fact is, you guys, that the resurrection is for everyone, and therefore the shroud is for everyone. So there is a receptivity among the laity that when you go up into the ranks, into the higher pastors and that type of thing, perhaps that's not quite there. Regarding your second question, in prisons, I did have an opportunity to give this to the Women's Correctional Center in Nebraska. It's a state pen in York, Nebraska. And I gave it on Good Friday to these women. And I recall sitting there, they were sitting there, about 35 of them. And as the presentation was going along, usually people wait until the end, but these women were starting to see the idea that, hey, maybe Jesus really did rise from the dead. And they were shooting questions at me along the way. It was refreshing. It was wonderful. And by the end of the talk, they were happy, they were beaming, they were filled with joy, because you see, these gals were living their Good Friday. When you're in prison, which I've never been, I can't imagine, it must feel like a Good Friday. And many of these women have children, and they cry themselves to sleep at night. They can't hold their children. And they see this hope of the resurrection, and they say, hey, this is still in my future. And so I believe that the shroud, especially for our time, is a message of hope, that we may be living through a Good Friday, but we should be lived with every hope. We have an Easter Sunday in our future, and that's what those women taught me. Getting back just before the break here, you were asking about the carbon dating in the cloth there. I can real quickly state that when the nuns sewed the shroud back on this cloth, it was a 16th century cloth, they were trying to give the shroud strength. because it had holes in it. So they put it on a piece of cloth the same size as the shroud, about 15 feet by 4 feet, and they put patches on and they sewed it. And down in one of these corners where the 16th century cloth meets the sample site, one of the ideas is could there have been a mixture of those two? And it's an open question. First off, the fact that the carbon dating test has been invalidated, that is simply a scientific common knowledge, right? The question is, why was it invalid? There are three possibilities. It could have been a mixture of 16th century cloth with first century cloth, which was proposed by Ray Rogers in 2005, or it could be that there was an influx or a neutron influx from the body into the cloth, which make it appear younger. And the third hypothesis by Dr. Jackson is that the carbon monoxide levels near the ground are higher now than they were then. And so that alters the carbon-12, carbon-14 ratio. So there's three possibilities there. There are some open questions to the shroud, okay? For example, I'll say that, did it go through Edessa or did it go through Antioch? It's an open question. I believe that the propensity of weight points to Antioch. A second question is, where was it at during those missing years from 1204 to 1355? Whenever they have international shroud conferences, there's many papers on that. Of course, the third one, what caused the carbon-14 problem to be, why was there contamination? That's an open question. Fourthly was image formation. How did the image form? I would like to address that one here real quickly. Dr. Jackson proposed this in 1989. It's called the radiation fall-through hypothesis, and it states that, if you were to look at the shroud, say on Holy Saturday morning, you would have just seen bloodstains. The bloodstains would have gone on the cloth by direct contact. But the image, we believe, came later because we find that where the body image and the blood overlap, the blood is underneath. Think about that a second. If you were an artist, you would have put a body, somehow painted it on the sheet and then put bloodstains on it afterwards to make it anatomically correct. So the body image would be underneath the blood. Does that make sense?
Right.
All right. But the shroud doesn't show that. It shows that the blood came first. It's underneath Good Friday. And the image is on top, Easter Sunday. And this was validated with X-ray testing. And if there was a burst of light and the body became simultaneously mechanically transparent, the cloth would collapse down through the body, beginning with the nose, flattening out, producing in the plane of gravity, producing this 3D image of it would give 3D information encoded where we see the cloth distance body image and the darkness of the shroud. To put this in another way, I talked about mechanically transparent. What does that mean? Imagine at the moment of the resurrection, this burst of light coming from the body and the cloth dropping through the body. All right? We're all familiar with this. If we recall, how did Christ appear to the apostles on Easter night? They're locked in the upper room for fear. The door is locked, and Jesus somehow comes among them. He had a mechanically transparent body. It was no longer bound by the laws of nature or physical barriers. So if we accept that on faith, then the question becomes, when did that moment begin? And if that moment began at the moment of the resurrection, then this would be consistent with the shroud falling through a mechanically transparent body in the plane of gravity, accounting for a vertically aligned 3D image with no side images.
Amazing.
That's a lot to take in. A few seconds to
yeah.
process that. It makes a lot more sense when you can see my slides, guys. Your people haven't used their imaginations here, but I appreciate your comments earlier, Ruben, when you said, I wish people could see this. Yes, I wish you could see what I'm seeing. And
how can people invite you to their parish, Jim?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you my email address, and they can go from there to contact me. Okay, it's besaints2, BESAINTS, number 2 @gmail.com. besaints2 @gmail.com, and we could take it from there. I could give you my phone number, 402-421-7656. And for you audience people, I believe these podcasts are online, so you can go back and reference it later if you need to. Right. And invite me. I don't make a dime from doing this. I'll just get reimbursed for travel, and if people want to make a donation to the American Confraternity, the Holy Shroud, they can, but I don't make any money from this.
Jim, what does your calendar look like for 2021. Have you got any dates
Well,
already?
I've got about 15 of them lined up here, but there's 365 days of the year, so there's some, there's some openings coming up there yet. So I wouldn't rule out anything at this point. I got a few dates that are locked in, but there's still some open dates as well.
Jim,
it's basically a PowerPoint presentation, and I bring a replica of the Shroud. I understand from the company that makes these, they're out in Ventura, California. They've made less than 50 of these. EWTN has one. There's one in Shreveport, Louisiana. There's one in a museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, on the strip there. So there are a few places where you can see these actual size replicas, but they're commissioned by the photographer of the Shroud from that 1978 All-Star team, Barry Schwartz. Who's not a doctor. Barry Schwartz is a Jewish man, and he lives up on the Continental Divide, and he's an authority on the Shroud because people say, well, gosh, you must be an unbiased person. You're Jewish, but you're giving this information about the Shroud, and you seem to think it's authentic. He has a lot of credibility because of that. And Barry and I have been friends for a few years, and wonderful, delightful man to speak with. You've probably seen him on some of the National Geographic specials and things like that. Say, guys, one other thing I want to bring here, that I wanted to make sure I get this across, and many people have not heard this before. When they see these talks, they're going to see some information, some that they've heard, but whether they're a novice or an expert, they're going to see some new things. And this is kind of one of those new things, so to speak. On the Shroud, if you're familiar with the Bible verse, Isaiah 50, chapter 6, where the suffering servant says, I gave my back to those who beat me. I faced my cheek to those who plucked my beard. My face I did not shield from buffets. And if you could see the picture I'm looking at now, you could see, oh, here's the scourge marks. Yeah. There's a spot on the chin where the beard is missing. His beard has been pulled out. The forensic pathologist for Los Angeles County back in 1980 examined the Shroud, and he stated with certainty that the right cheek shows significant swelling compared to the left. And so pulling out the beard, scourging at the back, being struck in the face, the Shroud is a physical manifestation of how that prophecy of Isaiah was fulfilled.
Amen. Hey, Jim, on the last few seconds that we have, Jesse, did you have anything to say? You were gonna.
I was just gonna say that everything that Jim has said is very consistent with, again, just basic New Testament theology. Yeah. Jesus Christ says several times, "I am the light of the world." John chapter 8, John chapter 9, John chapter 14. If this image was formed by 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy, it's only that came from a dead body, that can only be an act of God. To me, that's one of the validations that this is supernatural.
That's right. To quote,
Jim, thank you very much. Ruben, wrap it up.
Thank you, Jim, for being with us. To quote Jim, science cannot prove the resurrection. Science cannot duplicate the resurrection. That's the shortcoming of science, not the resurrection. We love the presentation, Jim. Like you said, I wish we could see it in person so we see your PowerPoint.
Well, I'll tell you guys, if in the future you'd like to have it on again, be open to that if you want to do this in the future sometime.
Okay. Cool. You've been listening to Jesus 911. Stay tuned for Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Mashuda. We are 10-7 out.
Saint Faustina's Prayer for Priests. O my Jesus, I beg thee on behalf of the whole Church, grant it love and the light of thy Spirit, and give power to the words of priests, so that hardened hearts might be brought to repentance and return to thee, O Lord. Lord, give us holy priests. Thou thyself maintain them in holiness. O divine and great High Priest, may the power of thy mercy accompany them everywhere, and protect them from the devil's traps and snares, which are continually being set for the souls of priests. May the power of thy mercy, O Lord, shatter and bring to naught all that might tarnish the sanctity of priests. For thou canst do all things. Amen. Virgin most powerful, pray for us.